You can't sleep. I know. That is why I am here too. Tonight, we are not going to begin with a king, or a battle, or a hero standing on a wall shouting into the wind. Tonight, we begin with silence, a harbour at night, dark water moving slowly against the stones, a few ropes knocking against wooden posts, a ship that should have arrived before sunset, but did not. Somewhere inland, in a palace room lit by oil lamps, a scribe waits with a clay tablet in front of him. He has a message to write. Maybe it is a request for grain. Maybe it is a warning. Maybe it is one of those messages people write when they already know help may not come. The room is warm, the lamp is low. Outside, the city is still alive, but not as alive as it used to be. And all across the eastern Mediterranean, in places separated by sea, mountains, deserts, and royal borders, the same strange thing is beginning to happen. Ships are late. Messengers are missing. Storehouses are emptier than they should be. Kings write to other kings, and sometimes no answer comes back. This is the Insomnia Club, and tonight we are going back to the end of the Bronze Age, not to watch the world explode in one great fire. That is not really how it happened. We are going back to listen to an ancient world go quiet, slowly, unevenly, one harbour at a time, one palace at a time, one unanswered letter at a time. People often call it the Bronze Age collapse. That name sounds clean, almost too clean. It makes it sound like one clear thing happened. A collapse, a fall, a single disaster with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But history is usually messier than that. The Bronze Age did not end like a door slamming shut. It ended more like a lamp running out of oil. For a while, the flame still moves. It still looks alive. Then it grows smaller. Then the room becomes darker at the edges, and by the time anyone notices how dark it has become, the old world is already gone. Before we talk about the collapse, we need to sit for a moment inside the world that collapsed. Because the late Bronze Age was not a primitive world. It was not a scattered world of isolated villages and lonely chiefs. It was a connected world, more connected than people sometimes imagine. Around the eastern Mediterranean, there were kingdoms that knew each other. They traded with each other. They married into each other's families. They sent gifts, envoys, insults, apologies, threats, and requests. Egypt was there, old and powerful, stretching along the Nile. The Hittite Empire was there, ruling from the highlands of Anatolia. Mycenaean kings lived in palace centers across Greece. Ugarit stood on the Syrian coast, rich from trade. Cyprus mattered because of copper. Assyria and Babylonia watched from farther east. Canaanite cities lived between empires, sometimes independent, sometimes pulled into the orbit of larger powers. It was not one empire. It was a network, and that is important. Because networks can make people rich, they can make cities bright, they can carry goods, ideas, stories, and technologies across great distances. But networks can also carry fear, and when enough parts of a network fail at the same time, the failure does not stay in one place. It travels. In the Bronze Age, bronze itself was part of the problem. Bronze is a mixture, mostly copper with tin added to make it harder and more useful. Copper could come from places like Cyprus. Tin was harder. Tin had to travel, sometimes from very far away. So even the metal that gave the age its name depended on movement, on trade, on ships, on roads, on agreements, on trust. A bronze sword was not just a weapon. It was a whole world of connections made solid in a man's hand. A king could look at his chariots, his weapons, his palace gates, his bronze tools, and see strength. But underneath that strength was a question. What happens if the copper does not come? What happens if the tin does not come? What happens if the ships stop moving? In the palaces, everything looked controlled. That was the feeling these kingdoms wanted to create. Order, storage, accounting, tribute, labor, lists. The palace was not just where the king lived. It was the center of the economy. Goods came in. Goods went out. Grain, oil, wool, metal, pottery, weapons, livestock, luxury objects. Scribes recorded it. Officials counted it. Workers depended on it. Soldiers were fed by it. Craftsmen were supplied by it. Temples received from it. The palace system was impressive, but it was also heavy. It needed constant movement, constant records, constant harvests, constant obedience, constant belief that tomorrow would look mostly like yesterday. That is the hidden danger of a very organized world. It can look strong because everything has a place, but when too many things move out of place at once, the same organization that made it strong can make it brittle. Imagine a palace storehouse. Large jars lined against the wall, some full of grain, some full of oil, seals pressed into clay, a scribe's mark on each container. To the people inside the system, it feels permanent. The king has always stored grain. The scribes have always written. The farmers have always brought their share. The ships have always come. But permanence is often just habit, wearing a royal robe. And near the end of the Bronze Age, the habits began to break. A bad harvest is painful, but a bad harvest in one kingdom can be survived. A war on one border is dangerous, but one war does not end a world. A burned city is terrible, but cities had burned before. The strange thing about the end of the Bronze Age is the pattern. So many places struggling around the same time, so many palace systems weakening, so many old powers changing shape, so many fires in the archaeological record, so much writing disappearing in some areas, so many trade patterns shifting. The world did not fall because one stone cracked. It fell because the wall had too many cracks at once. Let us sit for a moment beside the sea. Not the bright blue Mediterranean of postcards, the darker one, the night sea, the one that carries news before anyone understands it. In the old world, the sea was not empty space. It was a road, a dangerous road, yes, but still a road. Ships moved along the coast. They carried copper, tin, grain, wine, oil, timber, pottery, ivory, cloth, and people. They carried merchants. They carried soldiers. They carried messengers. They carried brides for royal marriages. They carried skilled craftsmen. They carried rumors. And when rumors travel by ship, they arrive wet with salt and fear. A city like Ugarit understood this very well. Ugarit stood on the coast of what is now Syria. It was not the largest power in the world. It was not Egypt. It was not the Hittite Empire. But it mattered. It was a wealthy port kingdom, a place where languages, goods, and people crossed. A city of merchants, scribes, palace officials, and archives. And archives matter to us, because when a city leaves behind words, it leaves behind something more intimate than ruins. Stones tell us that something burned. Words tell us what people feared before the fire came. At Ugarit, archaeologists found tablets, clay tablets. Some of them were baked hard by the very destruction that ended the city. That is one of those details history gives us sometimes, quietly brutal. A fire meant to erase a city helped preserve its last words. In those last messages, we do not hear myth. We do not hear legends about gods fighting in the sky. We hear logistics, ships, troops, enemy movements, requests for help. A king explaining that his army is somewhere else. His ships are somewhere else. His city is exposed. This is why Ugarit is so powerful for this story, because the collapse becomes human there, not just civilizations fell, not just empires declined. A city was afraid. A ruler needed help. The soldiers were not where they needed to be. The ships were not where they needed to be, and danger was already close. That is not a clean theory. That is a nightmarish administrative problem. The kind of problem that sounds small until you understand what it means. If the enemy comes by sea but your ships are away, if the enemy comes by land but your troops are elsewhere, if your allies are busy with their own fires, then the map still says you have friends. But the night says you are alone. This is the feeling we need to keep. The Bronze Age collapse was not just destruction, it was abandonment. It was the discovery that the great system might not save you. For generations, kings had written to kings. They called each other brother. They exchanged gifts. They negotiated marriages. They argued about gold. They complained when gifts were too small. They spoke in the language of royal equality, royal pride, royal insult. It was almost like an international club of kings. But when the crisis came, the beautiful language of diplomacy met the ugly reality of distance. A letter could be written, a tablet could be sealed, a messenger could be sent. But the messenger still had to arrive, and help still had to exist. A great king can promise support, but what if his own borders are burning? What if his own harvest has failed? What if his own soldiers are needed at home? What if his own palace is already weaker than it looks? One of the quiet lessons of this age is that powerful people often know less than they pretend. They can see their own palace, their own walls, their own records, their own tribute. But they may not understand how close the wider system is to breaking. They may receive warnings and treat them as local problems. A city asks for grain. A border reports raiders. A province delays payment. A harbor reports strange ships. Each message seems like a separate trouble. Only later, when the archives are ash and the palace doors are broken, does it look like a pattern. People living through collapse rarely get to call it collapse. They call it a shortage, a bad season, a rebellion, a raid, a temporary problem, a thing the king will fix. And then the king does not fix it, or cannot. The Sea Peoples enter this story like figures seen through smoke. They are famous now because of Egyptian records, especially the inscriptions and reliefs from the reign of Ramesses III. At Medinet Habu, the Egyptians showed foreign groups coming by land and sea. They showed battles, ships, prisoners, families in ox carts, warriors with different helmets and clothing. The names are still discussed. Peliset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, Weshesh. Sheridan in other contexts. Luca in earlier records. Names that feel half visible, like hearing people call out from the far side of a storm. For a long time, it was easy to make the Sea Peoples the great villains of the collapse. They appeared from the sea. They attacked. They destroyed. The Bronze Age ended. It is a strong story, simple, visual, dramatic, but history usually punishes simple stories. The Sea Peoples were real in the sense that Egyptian records describe these groups. But who they were exactly, where they all came from and what they were doing, those are harder questions. Were they invaders? Some of them, yes, probably. Were they migrants? Possibly. Were they displaced people? Very likely in some cases. Were they pirates? Maybe some were. Were they soldiers looking for land? Maybe. Were they families moving because the old world had stopped feeding them? That is possible too. And maybe the hardest truth, is that one label may cover many different realities. Some came to fight. Some came to settle. Some came because they had nowhere else to go. Some may have been pushed by the same pressures that were crushing the kingdoms they attacked. So we should not imagine the Sea Peoples as a single dark army from nowhere. It is better to imagine movement, confusion, groups under pressure, waves of people passing through a world that was already unstable. The Egyptian records present Ramesses III as the king who stopped them. That is what royal inscriptions do. They show the king as order, the enemy as chaos. The king stands tall, the foreigners fall. Egypt survives because Pharaoh is mighty. This was not just history. It was propaganda, sacred kingship carved into stone. Still, behind the royal performance, something real happened. Egypt did face serious threats. Egypt did fight. Egypt did survive. But survival is not the same thing as health. A person can survive a fever and never be quite as strong again. A kingdom can win a battle and still lose its future. After Ramesses III, Egypt did not disappear, but the great outward power of the new kingdom faded. Its grip on territories weakened. Its wealth declined. Internal troubles grew. Tomb robberies, labor unrest, political strain. The old giant remained standing, but the old giant was tired. That is another important thing. The Bronze Age collapse did not mean every place vanished. Egypt survived. Assyria survived, though weakened for a time. Babylonia changed. Some cities were destroyed, some were abandoned, some adapted, some people moved, some traditions continued. Collapse is not the end of all life. It is the end of a structure. The people do not all disappear. They keep cooking. They keep burying their dead. They keep telling stories. They keep looking for food. They keep raising children. They keep using whatever tools remain. But the world above them changes. The palace is gone. The old writing system is no longer needed in the same way. The long-distance luxury trade is reduced. The great king is no longer the center of everything. The map becomes smaller, more local, more uncertain. Sometimes, after a collapse, people live closer to the ground. Less gold, less writing, less monument, less pride, more survival. And for archaeology, that can look like darkness. Not because nothing happened, but because fewer people were writing it down. In Greece, the Mycenaean palace world faded. The great centers like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and others belong to this world of palace power. They had administrators, storerooms, scribes using Linear B, a system that recorded goods and labor with impressive detail. But after the collapse of the palace system, Linear B disappears. That does not mean Greek people disappeared. It means that the palace administration that needed Linear B was gone. Writing, in that form, no longer had a home. Imagine that for a moment. Not just buildings destroyed, but a way of recording the world becoming unnecessary. A scribe trained to count palace goods, with no palace to serve. A storeroom system broken, a king's hall abandoned, a bureaucracy turning into memory. That is a different kind of silence. Not the silence of death, the silence of a closed office, a silent archive, a tablet never written. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire also fell apart. We should not turn this into a full Hittite episode tonight. That deserves its own night. The Hittites were powerful. They had fought Egypt. They had ruled a large and complex empire from Hattusa. They had their own diplomacy, laws, archives, gods, and royal anxieties. But by the early 12th century BCE, the Hittite imperial structure was gone. Hattusa was abandoned and burned. The old imperial center lost its role. Yet even here, the story is not as simple as everyone vanished. Hittite and Luwian traditions continued in smaller successor states, especially farther south and southeast. The empire died. The people did not. That distinction matters. A civilization can end as a political structure while its language, gods, habits, and memories survive in other forms. That is why collapse is strange. It destroys and preserves at the same time. It breaks the roof, but some of the stones are used to build smaller houses. It burns the archive, but one phrase survives in another language. It ends a kingdom, but not every song. Across the Levant, cities suffered in different ways. Some were destroyed, some changed hands, some declined, some transformed. Ugarit was not rebuilt as the same kingdom. Its voice in the archive stops, and that stop is one of the most haunting sounds in ancient history. A city can be loud for centuries in its documents. Then suddenly nothing. No more royal letters, no more accounts, no more messages saying the ships are away, just ruins, ash. And later, people like us trying to hear what happened. Cyprus too belongs to this story, but not as a simple victim. Cyprus was deeply tied to the bronze economy because of copper. It had important sites. It had trade links. It also went through disruption and change, but some places adapted. The early Iron Age world that came after the collapse was not only poorer or darker, it was also new, harder in some ways, more fragmented, but capable of invention. The Phoenician cities, for example, rose into a new kind of Mediterranean importance after the collapse. The alphabet spread. Iron became more common over time. New powers emerged. New identities formed. The world after 1200 BCE was not empty. It was rearranged. But before that rearrangement could become visible, there was a period of fear, and we are still in that fear tonight. Maybe the collapse becomes easier to understand if we do not begin with the causes as causes. Maybe we begin with people, a farmer first. Somewhere inland, away from the royal letters and the painted walls, a farmer looks at the field and knows the year is wrong. The soil is too dry. The grain is thinner than it should be. The sky has held back too long. He does not know anything about international trade. He does not know what a later historian will call climate pressure. He only knows that the harvest will not be enough. And when the harvest is not enough, everything above him begins to shake. The palace still expects grain. The officials still arrive. The storehouses still need filling. The soldiers still need feeding. The temples still need offerings. The king still has to look like a king. But the field does not care about royal order. The field gives what it gives. And if the field gives less, the palace has to take harder, or ration more carefully, or demand more from people who already have less. That is how a dry season becomes more than weather. It becomes pressure. Then imagine a merchant. He has spent his life trusting the sea. He knows which harbor is safe, which official expects a gift, which captain can be trusted, which season is dangerous, which city pays well for oil, which city needs copper, which route carries tin. His knowledge is practical, not glorious, but it is the kind of knowledge that keeps the world moving. Then one year, the old knowledge stops working. A harbor is unsafe. A captain does not arrive. A city that used to buy his goods has burned. A road is full of frightened people. A king demands more because his own stores are low. Another king cannot pay at all. The merchant is still alive. His skills are still real. But the world that made those skills useful has shifted underneath him. This is how trade breaks. Not always in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it breaks as doubt. One missed ship, then another. One risky harbor, then another. One route people no longer trust. And once enough people stop trusting the roads and the sea, the whole system begins to shrink. Now imagine a soldier, not a hero, not a name carved into stone, just a tired man sent from one trouble to another. A coast has been raided. A border is restless. A vassal city asks for help. The king needs troops in 2 places at once, maybe 3, maybe more. The soldier hears rumors before officials admit anything. Strange ships, burned towns, people moving with carts, families on the road, enemies who may be invaders or refugees or mercenaries, or all of those things at once. War, in a collapsing world, does not always look like one clean invasion. It looks like confusion with weapons. It looks like people under pressure pushing into other people under pressure. It looks like a kingdom trying to defend the coast while the inland roads are already afraid. Then imagine a palace worker. He knows the storerooms better than he knows the map. He has carried jars all his life. He knows the smell of grain, the weight of oil, the sound of scribes counting. He does not care about royal diplomacy. He cares about his ration, his family, his place in the system. If the palace gives less, he feels it. If officials become harsher, he sees it. If soldiers take food, he remembers. If rumors spread, he hears them while lifting jars in the dark. And if the palace can no longer feed the people who keep it alive, then the palace is no longer just threatened from outside. It is threatened from within. Loyalty is easier when the jars are full. It becomes harder when everyone is hungry. And then, underneath all of this, the ground itself could move. The Eastern Mediterranean was never a still place. Earthquakes came, walls cracked, buildings fell, fires started. A city can survive an earthquake. Many cities had survived them before. But a city survives because people rebuild, because food arrives, because workers are available, because the king has authority, because the roads still function, because another disaster does not arrive before the repairs are done. A shock becomes final when recovery is no longer possible. That may be the real heart of the Bronze Age collapse. Not one cause, not one villain, not one terrible year, just recovery running out. A bad harvest comes and the palace absorbs it. Another comes and the palace tightens its grip. Trade becomes uncertain and reserves are used. Raiders attack a coast and troops are sent. Another border needs troops and choices have to be made. A vassal asks for help and help is delayed. A city burns and officials call it local. Another city burns and they call it temporary. The ships stop coming. The letters take longer. The stores grow thinner. The roads become less safe. And one night, someone inside a palace understands the thing no one wants to say. The system is no longer bending. It is breaking. The people of the time did not know they were living at the end of the Bronze Age. That name came later. They did not say, "Our age is ending." They said, "The grain is late." They said, "The enemy is near." They said, "The ships have not returned." They said, "Noam, send help." They said, my troops are away." They said, "The king has not answered." They said ordinary things, emergency things, human things. And that is why this story is worth telling at night, because at night, history feels less like a diagram, more like a room. You can almost stand in it. You can almost hear the stylus pressing into wet clay. You can almost smell oil smoke from the lamp. You can almost hear someone outside the palace asking whether the harbour fires are signals or burning ships. Now let us look at the famous year, 1177 BCE. It is not magic. It is not the exact night the world ended. It is a useful symbol. The year is connected to the 8th year of Rameses III, when Egyptian records describe a major conflict with groups we call the Sea Peoples. The number became famous because it gives shape to a messy period. Humans like dates. Dates make chaos easier to hold. 476 for the fall of Rome in the west, 1453 for Constantinople, 1914 for the First World War, 1177 for the Bronze Age collapse. But dates can deceive us if we make them too heavy. The Bronze Age world did not collapse on one day in 1177. Many processes had begun earlier, some continued after, some regions declined before others, some recovered faster, some never returned to the old form. So 1177 is not a switch. It is a candle placed in the dark so we can see the room. Around that candle we see Egypt fighting, Ugarit falling, the Hittite Empire gone, Mycenaean palaces collapsing, trade routes changing, populations moving, old certainties breaking. It is enough, not as a single date of death, but as a sign, a marker, a way to say, around here the old world was no longer able to remain itself. The Bronze Age had its beauty. We should admit that. It had palaces, painted walls, skilled metalwork, international diplomacy, myths and songs, temples, ships crossing blue water, scribes trained in difficult scripts, craftsmen making objects fine enough to outlive kings. There was sophistication there. But beauty does not prevent fragility. A polished cup can break. A palace can starve. A great king can misunderstand the ground under his feet. And somewhere near the end, the Bronze Age world may have become too complex for its own shocks, too dependent on distant supplies, too reliant on palace centers, too proud of old formulas, too slow to adapt. That is not an insult to the people who lived then. It is just a human pattern. People keep trusting the old road, until one day the old road no longer takes them where it used to. Now, back to the sea. The sea was the road, but during the collapse the road became dangerous. Groups moved along it. Some attacked, some fled, some settled. Some were absorbed into new societies. The Peliset, often connected with the Philistines, appear in this larger transformation of the southern Levant. The Checker and others appear in Egyptian records. But we have to be careful not to turn names into simple ethnic labels. Ancient names in enemy records can be messy. A name carved by Egyptians may not tell us what those people called themselves. A group may include many origins. People under pressure can form new identities quickly. The Sea Peoples might be less a nation and more a moment, a name for motion during breakdown. That is more haunting, honestly. An enemy army is scary, but mass movement during systemic failure is scarier, because it means the old map has stopped holding people in place. In Medinet Habu, Rameses III wanted to show order restored. The king defeats chaos. The enemy is crushed. Egypt is safe. The images are powerful. But the stone victory does not show the exhaustion behind it. It does not show the cost of mobilization. It does not show the stress on the economy. It does not show the long decline after the battle. Royal art is not designed to whisper weakness. It is designed to shout control. But history listens for the whisper, and the whisper says, Egypt survived, but it did not return to the old height. That is the strange ending of many crises. The official story says victory. The deeper story says damage. A kingdom can win the battle that proves the world has changed. Now let us go north again, toward the Hittites. The Hittite Empire had once stood as one of the great powers of the age. It had fought the Egyptians at Kadesh. It had treaties, vassals, archives, a capital at Hattusa with walls, gates, temples, and administrative buildings. But by the time the Bronze Age world was breaking, the Hittite system was under pressure too. There were food concerns, military concerns, regional tensions, dynastic complexities. movements around the edges. And eventually the imperial center failed. Hattusa was abandoned and burned. We will keep this brief tonight. The full Hittite story can wait, but we need to feel the importance of its disappearance. When a great empire collapses, it does not only affect its own capital, it affects everyone tied to it. Vassals lose protection, trade agreements weaken, local rulers improvise, enemies test borders, refugees move, merchants recalculate, letters go unanswered. The fall of a great center sends silence outward. That is why the Hittite collapse belongs to the same night as Ugarit. Maybe not the same literal night, but the same historical darkness. One city asking for help, one empire unable to guarantee the old order, one sea full of danger, one age losing its voice. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean palaces were also part of this old world. Not exactly the same as Egypt or Hatti, but connected. They traded. They used writing for administration. They had elites and warriors and storerooms. They built citadels that still look stern and heavy today. At Mycenae, the walls are so massive later Greeks imagined giants had built them. Cyclopean walls, that is what people call them. Stones so large they seem beyond normal human work. But even walls like that did not save the palace world. Pylos was destroyed. Other centers suffered. The administrative system disappeared. Linear B fell silent. And after that, Greece entered a long period with fewer written records. Later, Greeks remembered a heroic age. They told stories of Troy, of Agamemnon, of warriors and long voyages. We should not treat Homer as a simple newspaper from the Bronze Age. But it is possible that memories of the Bronze Age world survived in distorted poetic form. A shining age of heroes, great kings, warriors with bronze, cities falling, ships crossing dangerous seas. Memory does not preserve history cleanly. It turns it into song. And maybe in those songs, the Greeks were remembering a world that had already died. There is something deeply human about that. When people lose a great world, they do not always write analysis. Sometimes they tell stories. They make the past larger, brighter, more tragic. They fill it with heroes because the real ending was too confused, too hungry, too administrative, too full of missing grain and absent ships. A hero dying before Troy is easier to sing than a bureaucratic network failing over decades. But both belong to the same human need, to give shape to loss. Now, if we follow the collapse too far, we will start entering many future episodes. Ancient Egypt deserves its own night. The Hittites deserve their own night. Mycenae deserves its own night. Ugarit deserves its own night. The Sea Peoples deserve their own careful discussion. So tonight, we will keep the focus where it belongs, not on each civilization as a biography, but on the space between them, the roads, the letters, the ships, the dependencies, the promises, the failures. That is the main character tonight, the network, and the network is what went silent. Think of the Eastern Mediterranean as a dark room with many lamps. Egypt is one lamp. Hatti is another. Ugarit another. Cyprus another. Mycenae another. Canaanite cities. Assyria, Babylonia, Crete. Each lamp has its own flame, but the oil moves between them. The wicks are trimmed by trade. The rooms are connected by corridors. For a long time the light seems shared. Then one lamp flickers. Another burns low. Another is knocked over. Another still stands, but its oil is almost gone. No single lamp explains the darkness. The darkness comes because the room depended on all of them together. And when enough of them failed, the room changed. After the collapse, There was no simple return. That is another thing people sometimes misunderstand. When a crisis passes, we expect recovery. The storm ends, the city rebuilds, the king returns, trade resumes. But sometimes the old form does not come back, because the people who knew how to run it are gone, or because the roads are different, or because the political center has lost legitimacy, or because smaller communities no longer want the old palace burden, or because new technologies and new groups create a different future. The Iron Age did not simply replace the Bronze Age overnight. Iron had existed earlier. Bronze did not disappear immediately. But over time, iron became more important. It was not just a metal change, it was part of a wider transformation. Smaller states, new powers, new trade routes, new scripts, new languages rising, new identities. The old club of late Bronze Age kings was gone. In its place came a more fragmented world, less glamorous at first, less monumental in some regions, but full of seeds. Phoenician sailors would carry goods and letters across the Mediterranean. The alphabet would spread and change. The Israelites would emerge in the highlands. The Philistines would settle along the coast. Aramaean groups would become important in Syria and beyond. Greek communities would eventually develop new forms that led, centuries later, to the polis. Assyria would rise again with terrifying force. The world after the collapse was not a dead world. It was a wounded world becoming something else. That is often how history works. The end of one age becomes the soil of another. But for the people living inside the ending, it probably did not feel like soil. It felt like loss. Let us return one final time to Ugarit, because if this story has a heart, it is there. Not because Ugarit was the greatest kingdom, but because its last words feel so close. A ruler trying to explain that his resources are not where they need to be. A city exposed. A crisis arriving faster than help. Clay tablets that survived because fire hardened them. There is a terrible poetry in that. A message written in fear becomes readable 3,000 years later because the fear came true. And now we sit here at night, long after the palaces fell, reading the shape of their panic. The people of Ugarit did not know they were becoming evidence. They were trying to survive. That is the thing to remember. Everyone in this story was trying to survive. The Egyptians carving victories, the Hittite officials managing a strained empire, the Mycenaean scribes counting goods, the Cypriot merchants watching ships, the people we call sea peoples moving through chaos, the farmers hoping rain would come, the workers waiting for rations, the kings writing letters with royal language while fear grew outside the walls. No one thought they were a chapter title. They were tired, hungry, proud, confused, brave sometimes, cruel sometimes, ordinary often, and caught in a system larger than themselves. By the 12th century BCE, the old world of the late Bronze Age was breaking into pieces, not everywhere the same way, not all at once, not with one cause, but enough that the age after it was different. The palace economies of the Aegean and Anatolia were gone or transformed. The Hittite Empire had vanished as an imperial power. Ugarit had fallen silent. Egypt had survived, but weakened. Cities along the coast changed. Trade shifted. Writing disappeared in some places and continued in others. People moved. New groups appeared. Old names faded. The Bronze Age ended not because bronze stopped shining, but because the world that made bronze powerful no longer held together. That is the quiet truth. A material can define an age, but a system keeps it alive. And when the system fails, even the strongest metal becomes a memory. And now, after all that noise, there is silence again. The palaces are ruins. The tablets are in museums. The harbours are changed. The kings are names. The ships are gone. But the questions remain. What holds a world together? How much pressure can it take? How long can a system pretend it is fine? And when the letters stop being answered, how long before everyone knows? Maybe that's enough for tonight. We do not need to solve every mystery. Some ancient doors should stay half open. Some names should remain a little blurred. The sea peoples can stay partly in the mist. Ugarit can keep some of its silence. Egypt can stand in the distance, old and tired. The Hittite roads can disappear into the dark hills of Anatolia, and the sea can go on moving, as it always has. Dark water against stone, ropes knocking softly in the harbour, a lamp burning low in a palace room, a scribe pressing a final message into clay. Somewhere a ship does not arrive. Somewhere a king waits for help. Somewhere an age is ending, not with one scream, but with many small silences. And maybe that is how old worlds usually end, not all at once, not neatly, not the way later historians would like. They end when people keep doing ordinary things, inside a world that has already changed too much. They end when the roads still exist, but no one trusts them. When the palace still stands, but no one believes it can protect them. When the king still speaks, but the words no longer move the world. When the sea is still there, but it no longer brings what it used to bring. Tonight we watched the Bronze Age go quiet, not completely. Nothing human ever disappears completely, but quiet enough that a new age had to begin. An age of iron, of smaller kingdoms, of new alphabets, of new fears, of new stories. And behind those stories, like a shadow, the memory of a brighter, older world. A world of bronze, a world of palaces, a world of letters between kings, a world that thought it knew how tomorrow would come, until tomorrow came differently. So, if you are still awake, that is all right. I am still here. The old sea is still moving. The dark is not empty. It is full of ruins, names, lamps, and lost harbours. And for a little while longer, you do not have to sit with it alone. Welcome to the Insomnia Club.